I get an opportunity to travel a lot with my position as essentially a city manager. And I get to visit cities all over the country and literally all over the world. And one of the things that's always amazing to me is that everyone brings you downtown. Downtown is gorgeous. It's beautiful. There's baseball stadiums, football stadiums, all kinds of interactive art and culture. All of this is happening downtown. And so usually I'm at a hotel, beautiful hotel downtown, and I like to walk. I love to walk. And so I'll leave the hotel and I'll start walking out of downtown. And the farther that you walk from downtown, the more that you'll see that the beautiful coffee shops and boutiques start to transition into liquor stores and gun shops, payday lenders. And you see that those beautiful coffee shops now turn into places that healthy foods are not available. And as I started to look at this, we were talking about these kinds of economic models that this that creates, essentially. And so the mayor and I were talking, and we were really saying that what we're actually looking at are economic models of humiliation. And so when you look at blight and crime and poor educational outcomes, those are essentially economic models of humiliation. They are about extraction of resources from communities. And this has happened all over the country and all over the world as we've depleted resources and used them for different means. And so what we said was that we needed to focus on a new economic model. How do we create an economic model that's focused on the inherent dignity of every single citizen in the city? What would that look like? And as we started to think about this and we started to try and make this transition, we started to say, well, how would we spell out what this economic model would look like? What would be the goals of a dignity economy? And so we started to spell out 5 goals that were essentially the ways that we thought we could deliver an economic model based on the inherent dignity of every citizen. The first goal was healthy citizens. Just how do we focus on the physical and mental health of every citizen in the city? How do we have clean air, clean water, and the availability of recreation? Affordable homes in safe neighborhoods. This deals with everything from community policing all the way down to livable cities, right? A thriving educational system, the backbone of our economy. How do we focus on not just strong public K-12 education, but also pre-K education? And then how do we create a durable bridge to higher education and the world of work? Everybody wants to talk about jobs, jobs, jobs. But what does it mean to have a living wage? We have so many citizens that are working 2, 3, and 4 jobs just to make ends meet. If you're working 3 jobs, you can't go to PTA meetings. You can't invest in your children, much less invest in your community, and the last person that you invest in is yourself. As an artist, this one really resonates with me. This idea of a cohesive city experience that incorporates inclusive art and culture to all of its residents and visitors. We often find this focused on our visitors, but we've got to focus on all of our residents as well, so that they live in this inclusive community of art and culture. So as we started to think about these 5 goals and how do we actually execute around this strategy, I started to realize that there are influences that actually govern the way cities make decisions. Policy is the way that we drive innovation and change in a municipal government. But there are factors that want to limit the ways that policy can serve as an innovator. And there are three main factors that I quickly began to recognize. The first influence is political, second is social, and the third, emergency. We see political influences all the time, and political influences are usually the influence of the individual to drive policy for the group. What that means is that instead of focusing on the needs of the entire community, there becomes the need of the individual, which actually is one of those extractive forces. It starts pulling resources away from our communities. The second is social impacts, and we find this when we have groups that are really pushing policy to see where it can go, and what that again means is that you're making things better for the group, but you're not focusing on what's happening for the rest of the community. The biggest one is emergency. We see this all the time. I like to tell my kids, I drive a car, and when I drive my car, I make sure that I change the oil, I make sure that I rotate the tires, I put gas in it, I do all the things that I need to do to maintain that car, because I know that if I don't do those things, I'm going to have a huge bill that's waiting for me later on. Cities, we've seen infrastructure that has been under-maintained for decades and decades and decades. And what that means is that the city has essentially been driving a car that they've never changed the oil in. And so what we've seen is that we have to be able to think about how we use data to focus on how we change the ways that we look at emergency situations. And the whole point is that we can't have a run-to-failure model. And that's what's been happening around the country. So what we've said is that we've got to have a data-driven decision and prioritization process. What does that look like to focus on real data to be able to inform how we create policy and how we prioritize across the city? When we look at the data, the first thing it tells us is that we've got to be young. We've got to focus young. 90% of children in Jackson and Mississippi enter kindergarten poorly equipped for the learning environment. What that means is that we have kids that are in an educational race with kids all around the world. And our children are behind. Essentially, the rest of the world, the kids are in the starting gates. They've been working out, they've been exercising, they've all got the right track shoes, and they are ready to run. And our kids haven't even made it into the stadium yet, and they ain't got no shoes. One of the new investments that we're making as a city is universal pre-K. How do we focus on making sure that every child enters kindergarten ready to learn? We know that right now, estimates of prison populations 10 to 15 years in the future are begin to measured by the third grade reading gate. And we can measure the number of kids that are not passing the third grade reading grade and extrapolate how many people we're going to need in prisons in 10 to 15 years. If there's anything that we can do to change outcomes for the next 100 years, we have to focus young. We've got to be fast. Younger in my life, I thought I was something of an athlete. And one of my coaches was always like, speed wins. Speed is what gets you ahead. One of the things that we've focused on is ultra-high-speed broadband. How do we look at networks as the new enterprise of the 21st and 22nd century? How do we use that as a driver in our educational system and use it as a lever to increase and sustain economic development for our communities? As we grow and we build on these networks, we can actually include the kinds of resources that are needed for exponential growth. A lot of people, when I listen to a lot of discussions, I hear people say that, well, I think that we need to move in an ordinal process. We need to make stepwise progress. And what we've said is, no, we need to leapfrog into a new space. We need to jump into a new space. We don't have to go through all the steps that everybody else went through. We can use our networks to literally leapfrog us into the future. We've got to be fast. The last thing is we've got to be inclusive. When I look around cities and we talk about these economic models, there are all of these models that are focused on these kinds of golden economies, right? We're focused on the top level of the economic structure, and then we hope that there's going to be jobs that kind of fall down underneath of that. But what we've seen is that the threat of automation means that some of those jobs, many of those jobs that we expected to be underneath those top-tier jobs are no longer there. And so now, how do we focus on being able to create essentially a model where people can plug in at different levels? What you see in front of you is a logic model of how we've thought about having this stratified economic model. And what does it mean to have occupational opportunities that are throughout the community? And we have intentional places for folks to plug in. It's so important that as we think about our growth, we think about all communities, and that we have to think inclusive. Inclusivity is probably the largest problem that we find in cities today. One of the quotes that our mayor says, and I love to hear, is that we never want to create islands of wealth surrounded by seas of poverty. And we definitely don't want to have programmatic ideas that move people from one state of misery to a greater state of misery. So how do we create a focus that elevates the entire community? I believe that the next 100 years of Jackson is extremely bright. I think that we have the potential for exponential growth and also the potential to serve as a model, not just for Mississippi, not just for the US, but a model for the world. But I think that we'll only get there if we're young, fast, and inclusive. Thank you.